stabbed his nephew Jesse multiple times in his upper body and threw his arm into his chest. And he stabbed his niece Sophia 17 times over her entire 45-pound body.
On November 19th, 2018, Keith Caneiro spends the day the way he spends most of his days. He's 50 years old, the founder and CEO of a tech company called Square One Enterprises. And by this point in his life, work isn't really a separate category from everything else. It's woven into all of it. He runs the business out of Asbury Park. He built the mansion he lives in with his own success. He is, by every account people will later give of him, a driven man, occasionally hot-tempered, but someone who loves his family and works hard to keep the life he's built for them intact. That evening, at his home on Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck, New Jersey, Keith gets on the phone with his older brother, Paul, his business partner, his childhood best friend, the person he trusts with more of his financial life than almost anyone. The call is not friendly. Keith has questions about a trust account. He wants login credentials. He wants to see, for himself, exactly where his money has gone. He gives Paul a deadline, 2 hours. It is, on the surface, an argument between two brothers who've had arguments before. By most accounts, this is how the Caneiro brothers operate, flashes of tension that blow over by lunch the next day. Keith hangs up the phone that night believing, as he always has, that whatever this is will get resolved like everything else between them always has. He goes to bed in his own home, in a life he built, next to his wife of over a decade. Down the hall, his two children. Jesse, 11, and Sophia, 8, are asleep in their own rooms. Keith Caneiro will never wake up in that house again. Neither will his wife. Neither will his children. Sometime between that phone call and sunrise, someone walks into their home and ends all 4 of their lives. Keith first, outside, then Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse inside. Then that same person sets the house on fire. 10 miles away, in a much smaller home in Ocean Township, a different fire alarm goes off a few hours earlier that same morning. A man, his wife, and their 2 daughters stumble out into the cold. They cough, they shake, they survive. 2 fires, same family name on both properties. And at the center of all of it, one question that will take investigators years, 1 7-week trial, and a jury just 3 hours to answer completely. What happens when the person a family trusts most decides that person is worth more to him dead than alive? This is the story of Paul Caneiro. Before we uncover what happened inside those 2 homes that November morning, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy carefully researched true crime stories that go beyond the headlines. Every week, we examine the evidence, the investigations, and the courtroom battles behind some of the world's most unforgettable cases. To understand how a business partnership between 2 brothers ended in a quadruple murder, you first have to understand what that partnership looked like from the outside. Because the outside version of the Caneiro family was, for years, one of the more enviable stories in Monmouth County, New Jersey. Keith Caneiro built Square One Enterprises, a technology company based in Asbury Park, into something substantial enough to fund the kind of life most people only imagine. By 2018, he and his wife, Jennifer, 45, lived in a $1.5 million estate in Colts Neck, an affluent horse country town where celebrities like Bruce Springsteen and Jon Stewart owned property, and where the biggest local controversies usually involved zoning disputes, not homicide. Keith and Jennifer had 2 children, Jesse, 11, and Sophia, 8. From every angle anyone outside the family could see, it was the picture of a life that had worked out. Standing beside Keith in nearly every version of that picture was his older brother, Paul. Paul Caneiro was 51 years old in 2018, married to his wife, Susan, raising 2 daughters of his own in a comfortable home about 10 miles away in Ocean Township. For years, Paul had been more than Keith's brother. He was his business partner, tied to Keith financially in ways that went well beyond a shared last name. The 2 men had built things together. They had bank access to each other's accounts. They had the kind of financial intimacy that only exists between people who trust each other completely or who have simply never had a reason not to. When prosecutors eventually stood in front of a jury and tried to explain who Paul Caneiro was, they had to work against a version of him that Paul's own extended family had spent years reinforcing. Witnesses who knew both brothers described Paul as the even-tempered one, the peacekeeper, the one who stayed calm when Keith's temper flared, the one who was, in the words of people close to the family, very protective of his younger brother. When the two men argued, it was almost always Keith who lost his cool first, according to testimony. Paul was the one who absorbed it, who smoothed things over, who made sure that whatever tension flared up between them got resolved before it could do any lasting damage. They'd fight. They'd make up. They'd go out to lunch like nothing happened. That was the pattern everyone around the Caneiros understood to be true, right up until the early morning hours of November 20th, 2018, when it stopped being true in the most violent way imaginable. It's worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it's exactly the image the prosecution would eventually have to dismantle, piece by piece, testimony by testimony, 7 years later in a courtroom in Freehold, New Jersey. Nearly everyone who knew Paul Caneiro described a man who seemed incapable of the thing he was about to be accused of. That disconnect is not unusual in cases like this one. People who commit extreme violence against their own families are very rarely strangers to anyone around them. They are, more often than not, the even-tempered brother, the protective uncle, the business partner who always seemed like the reasonable one in the room. But underneath the surface of that partnership, something had been quietly going wrong for a long time. And by the fall of 2018, it was about to come apart. Square One Enterprises had grown enough over the years that both brothers' financial lives were, to some degree, intertwined with the company's success. Keith held the title and the public-facing role of CEO, but Paul's involvement went beyond a simple employee relationship. He had access, influence, and a level of financial entanglement with his brother that made the two men's fortunes rise and fall together in ways that weren't always visible to people outside their immediate circle. That kind of arrangement isn't unusual among family businesses. Siblings who grow up together, who trust each other implicitly, often build exactly this kind of shared financial architecture. Joint accounts, informal arrangements, a general assumption that neither party would ever need to formally audit the other. For most families, that assumption holds. For the Caneiros, it held for years, right up until the fall of 2018, when something in Keith's own review of the business's finances started to look wrong to him. Numbers that didn't reconcile, withdrawals he didn't remember approving, a pattern that, once he started pulling on the thread, wouldn't stop unraveling. What Keith didn't know, and what prosecutors would only be able to fully reconstruct years later through forensic accounting, was how long that pattern had actually been going on, and how much was actually at stake for Paul if it came fully to light. Have you ever had a falling out with someone close to you over money? Let us know below. Before this case became a headline, before it became a 7-week trial and a 4-count murder conviction, it was simply a family. One that people in Colts Neck saw at school drop-off, at the grocery store, at the kinds of community events that make a small, wealthy town feel smaller than it is. Keith Caneiro didn't come from money. By most accounts, he built Square One Enterprises the hard way, growing a technology consulting business from the ground up into something substantial enough to buy a mansion in one of Monmouth County's most desirable towns. Friends and former colleagues would later describe him as intense, driven, occasionally difficult, the kind of boss who expected a lot because he asked a lot of himself first. He was also, by every account that would come out during the trial, a deeply involved father, someone who structured his life around his children even as he ran a demanding business. Jennifer Caneiro, 45, was Keith's wife of over a decade. Neighbors described the family as friendly, if somewhat private. The kind of people who waved from their car in the driveway but didn't necessarily linger for long conversations. Jennifer was known in the community as an attentive mother, active in her children's lives at school and beyond. Jesse, 11, and Sophia, 8, were, in the words of people who knew the family, exactly what you'd expect from kids that age. Energetic, close to each other, still young enough that their parents' divorce from the wider adult world of business disputes and financial arrangements had nothing to do with them at all. They didn't know their uncle owed anyone an explanation. They didn't know their father had made a phone call demanding one. They were children, asleep in their own beds on what should have been an unremarkable Tuesday night. It's easy, in true crime storytelling, to let the forensic details and the courtroom drama crowd out the fact that this case is fundamentally about four people who had no idea their final night had already arrived. Jesse would never make it to middle school graduation. Sophia would never make it past the 3rd grade. Jennifer would never see her children grow into adults. Keith would never resolve the argument he believed, right up until the moment he died, was simply another rough patch in a relationship he'd spent his whole life investing in. The extended Caneiro family, cousins, in-laws, longtime family friends, would spend the next 7 years watching that ordinary Tuesday night get picked apart in courtrooms, in headlines, and eventually in front of a jury who had to sit through testimony about exactly how each of them died. For them, this case was never really about forensic evidence or financial motive. It was about the empty chairs at every holiday gathering since 2018, chairs that belonged to people who should still be sitting in them. Colts Neck itself is the kind of town where people move specifically to give their kids a certain kind of childhood. Good schools, wide yards, a sense of safety that comes with distance from denser, more chaotic parts of the state. Jesse and Sophia attended local schools alongside other children in the community, and in the days after the murders, those schools became gathering points for a kind of grief the town had never had to process before. Teachers and administrators were suddenly counseling classmates who didn't fully understand why 2 of their friends weren't coming back. Vigils were held. Flowers and stuffed animals piled up outside the family's property, a makeshift memorial for 2 children whose biggest concerns, days earlier, had been ordinary ones. Homework, friendships, whatever shows they were watching that week. For a community built around the assumption of safety, the murders were disorienting in a way that extended well beyond the immediate family. Parents who had never thought twice about their children's safety in Colts Neck found themselves, for the first time, genuinely rattled. Not because there was any ongoing threat, but because the case forced an uncomfortable realization that violence this extreme didn't require a stranger, a break-in, or any of the external threats communities like this one typically organize their sense of safety around. It came, instead, from inside a family that looked, from every visible angle, just like every other family on the street. None of the witnesses who testified about the brothers' easy relationship were ever in the room for the conversations that actually mattered. The ones about money, the ones that happened behind closed doors between 2 men who ran a business together and, until that November, had never had to explain themselves to each other. That's what came out later, in the parts of this case the extended family never saw coming. Paul and Keith didn't just share a last name. They shared bank access, shared business decisions, and, according to what prosecutors would eventually lay out at trial, a financial arrangement that had, over time, quietly tilted in Paul's favor. Prosecutors alleged that Paul had been siphoning money out of accounts tied to his brother, more than $75,000 over time, funds that helped prop up a lifestyle that, from the outside, looked identical to Keith's, but that Paul may not have been able to sustain on his own. For a long time, none of it mattered because no one was looking. That's how trust works between brothers who've spent their whole lives assuming the best of each other. But on the evening of November 19th, 2018, that assumption cracked. At around 6 o'clock that evening, Keith called Paul, and according to testimony at trial, he was furious. He demanded Paul hand over login credentials to a trust account. He wanted to look at the numbers himself. He gave Paul an ultimatum, 2 hours to respond, or else. We don't know exactly what was said on that call because the only 2 people who do are Keith Caneiro, who would be dead within 12 hours, and Paul Caneiro, who has spent every year since insisting under oath that he had nothing to do with what happened next. What we do know is what that phone call represented and why prosecutors would spend so much of the trial building toward it. For years, Paul had built a life that looked, from the outside, remarkably like his brother's. The house, the family, the appearance of financial stability. But appearances and bank balances don't always match, and prosecutors argued that by the fall of 2018, Paul's own finances were under real strain, propped up in part by money that wasn't his to take. A 2-hour deadline to explain missing funds isn't just an uncomfortable conversation between siblings. For a man who had allegedly built a second income stream out of his brother's blind trust, it was an ultimatum that threatened to expose everything at once. The theft, the years of deception, and the version of himself he had spent a lifetime presenting to the people who loved him most. If Keith had followed through the next morning and actually looked at those account records, the even-tempered brother that everyone at trial described would have had nowhere left to hide. He never got the chance to look. Financial motive is one of the oldest and most common threads running through family homicide cases, and it's also one of the hardest for outside observers to fully understand. Losing a business partnership or facing exposure over financial misconduct doesn't typically feel to the outside world like a reason significant enough to justify the murder of 4 people, including 2 children. But prosecutors who have handled cases like this one for years understand something that can be difficult to reconcile from the outside. For a person who has spent years constructing an identity around success, stability, and being the reliable one, the threat of that identity collapsing can feel less like an inconvenience and more like an existential threat. Losing money is recoverable. For some people, losing face, especially in front of the family members who have always seen you as the responsible, trustworthy one, apparently is not. Court records and financial testimony presented at trial painted a picture of a man who had, over years, built a lifestyle that outpaced what his own income could reasonably sustain. Investigators who reconstructed years of banking history found a pattern of transfers, withdrawals, and unexplained account access that, taken individually, might have looked unremarkable. Taken together, prosecutors argued, they told the story of a brother quietly living beyond his means for years, propped up by money that was never really his, and a looming reckoning that, once triggered by that November 19th phone call, Paul apparently decided he would rather prevent through violence than face honestly. It's worth noting that nothing about this motive was inevitable. Plenty of people face financial exposure, embarrassment, even legal consequences for mismanaging shared money, and the vast, overwhelming majority of them do not respond by murdering their own family. What separates a case like this one isn't the existence of a motive. Financial disputes between family members are common, even mundane. It's the decision, made by one specific person, to treat that dispute as something worth ending 4 lives to avoid confronting. The fire alarm in Paul Caneiro's Ocean Township home goes off just after 5 a.m. Paul, his wife Susan, and their 2 daughters make it out. The house sustains damage, but everyone inside survives, and by most accounts, the family is shaken but unharmed. 10 miles away, in Colts Neck, a second fire doesn't start until later that morning. And this time, there's no warning, because there's no one left inside the house to raise one. When firefighters and police reach the mansion on Willowbrook Road, they find Keith Caneiro's body outside, on the front lawn, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Inside the house, already badly damaged by the fire tearing through it, they find Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse. The medical examiner's office would later confirm what investigators suspected almost immediately. All 4 members of Keith's family died from what officials termed homicidal violence, not from the fire itself. That distinction would matter enormously to the case being built against Paul. Whoever did this hadn't set a fire that spiraled out of control and accidentally killed a family. The killings came first, deliberate, and close range. The fire came second, an attempt to erase them, or at least to erase enough evidence that the truth might never surface. Keith had been shot multiple times outside his own home in what investigators would eventually characterize as an ambush near his own front door. Inside, Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse had been attacked before the flames ever reached them. It would take years. And eventually, graphic forensic testimony delivered in a courtroom in front of a jury who would later describe the day as one of the heaviest of their lives, before the full details of how each of them died would become public. For now, in the first chaotic hours after the fires, the scene told investigators only this: it had been deliberate. It had been close. And it had been personal in a way that random home invasions almost never are. News of a quadruple homicide in a town like Colts Neck spread within hours. This was a horse country community that had never seen anything remotely close to this kind of violence. Reporters descended on Willowbrook Road by that afternoon. Neighbors who had waved to Keith Caneiro in his driveway 100 times were suddenly fielding questions from television crews about whether they'd ever noticed anything strange about the family. Monmouth County Prosecutor Christopher Gramiccioni addressed the press that first day, choosing his words with obvious care. "We believe that this family, in some form or fashion, was targeted," he told reporters. Careful not to name a suspect publicly, even as investigators, behind the scenes, were already looking hard in one very specific direction. 10 miles away, in a police station in Ocean Township, Paul Caneiro sat with his wife and daughters, having just watched his own home go up in flames hours earlier, and, according to one detective who observed him that morning, remained strikingly quiet while the rest of his family wept upon learning that Keith and his entire family were dead. That detail, a man staying calm while everyone around him fell apart, would end up meaning very little on its own. Grief looks different on everyone. But combined with everything investigators would uncover in the days and weeks that followed, it became one small piece of a picture that was about to come into focus with devastating clarity. In those first hours, the scale of the tragedy was almost too large for the small police departments involved to process. Colts Neck relies on a relatively small local force, and a quadruple homicide of this scope required immediate coordination with the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, which handles major crimes throughout the county. Detectives, evidence, technicians, and fire investigators descended on Willowbrook Road throughout the day, working to preserve a crime scene that fire and water damage had already begun to compromise. Every hour that passed made the forensic picture more fragile. Soot, ash, and the chemical residue of firefighting foam threatening to obscure evidence that investigators would need to build any future case. At the same time, a separate team of investigators worked the scene at Paul's Ocean Township home, treating it, at least initially, as a second and possibly connected crime scene rather than simply the home of a grieving relative. That dual-track investigation. One team working a quadruple homicide, another working what still looked, on the surface, like an unrelated arson, would eventually converge into a single case. But on the morning of November 20th, none of that convergence had happened yet. All anyone knew for certain was that a respected local businessman, his wife, and his 2 young children were dead, and that his brother's house, 10 miles away, had also caught fire hours earlier under circumstances nobody could yet explain. For the first responders who arrived at the mansion that morning, the scene would stay with them for years. Officers who had handled routine calls throughout their careers found themselves, without warning, standing in the aftermath of one of the worst crimes in the county's history, a fact that would come up again and again throughout the trial 7 years later, as veteran detectives and fire investigators described, on the stand, what they'd found that morning and how it had shaped the years of investigative work that followed. What would you have thought if you were in that police station that morning? Let us know below. Within a day of the murders, before anyone had officially been charged in the deaths of Keith, Jennifer, Sophia, or Jesse, Paul Caneiro was already in handcuffs, but not for murder, for arson. Investigators had moved fast on the fire at Paul's own home, and what they found troubled them. The blaze wasn't accidental. According to a criminal complaint later obtained by local reporters, police alleged Paul had set fire to his own residence using gasoline, igniting it while his wife and 2 daughters were still inside. No one was hurt. But the deliberate nature of the fire, combined with its timing, hours before a second, far deadlier fire at his brother's home, was enough for investigators to move on Paul almost immediately. He was charged with aggravated arson on November 21st, just 1 day after the fires. At a press conference announcing the charge, Prosecutor Gramiccioni again chose his words carefully, declining to confirm or deny whether Paul was a suspect in his brother's murder. He didn't need to say it outright. Everyone watching understood the implication. The surviving brother, the one whose own house had burned first, whose own family had made it out unharmed, was the same man now accused of setting that fire himself. Paul's attorneys pushed back immediately and forcefully. His lawyer, Robert Honecker, a former top prosecutor in the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office himself, told reporters that Paul's family fully supports him and that there was absolutely no reason in the world for Paul Caneiro to have committed the crimes. Paul, his defense insisted, loved his brother deeply, loved his brother's family, had no plausible motive, no history of violence, nothing that made sense of the direction investigators seemed to be heading. But investigators had already begun connecting the pieces: the financial dispute, the timing of the two fires, the physical evidence they were quietly gathering from both properties. And what they found painted a very different picture than the one Paul's defense was offering to the public. Within days, prosecutors filed the charges nobody wanted to say out loud, but that everyone following the case had begun to expect: murder. 4 counts, along with a second arson charge, this time for the fire that had consumed Keith's mansion. Prosecutors alleged that Paul had shot Keith to death outside his home, then gone inside and killed Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse before setting the house on fire to destroy evidence, and that he had then driven back to his own home in Ocean Township and set a second fire there, using his own family as a kind of unwitting alibi. If his own house burned too, if his own wife and daughters had to be pulled from smoke and rescued by firefighters who would think to suspect him of anything, it was, prosecutors would later argue at trial, the only piece of the plan that worked exactly as intended. In the chaos of that first day, nobody suspected Paul, not the responding officers, not the firefighters who pulled his family from their burning home, not even, at first, his own extended family. The very people sitting beside him at the police station as the news of Keith's death began to sink in. Investigators, however, moved quickly once the arson charge gave them legal grounds to search Paul's property in detail. Detectives with the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office and the Ocean Township Police Department combed through his home, his vehicles, and eventually his financial records, working alongside fire marshals trying to reconstruct exactly how and when both blazes had been set. A neighbor later told reporters that Paul had been seen near his own home about half an hour before the fire broke out there, a detail that, combined with everything else investigators were piecing together, only deepened suspicion around his account of that night. Prosecutor Gramiccioni, in the days following the arson charge, tried to reassure a rattled community that there wasn't some unknown killer targeting the extended Caneiro family at random. "We believe that this family in some form or fashion was targeted," he repeated at a subsequent press conference, a carefully worded statement that avoided naming Paul directly while still steering public understanding away from the fear of a random attacker still at large. For a town like Colts Neck, still absorbing the fact that a quadruple homicide had happened inside one of its most recognizable homes, that reassurance mattered, even as it left the actual identity of the person responsible technically unconfirmed for the public record. Meanwhile, Paul's defense team worked to get ahead of the narrative. Attorney Robert Honecker gave interviews emphasizing that no evidence had been produced, connecting his client to the killings, framing the arson charge as separate and unrelated to whatever had happened at Keith's mansion. "There is absolutely no reason in the world for Paul Caneiro to have committed the crimes," the defense statement read, adding that Paul just couldn't say no to his family. An odd, almost prophetic phrase in hindsight, one that would take on a very different meaning once prosecutors laid out their theory of the case at trial 7 years later. By the time the murder charges were formally filed, Paul had already spent days in custody on the arson charge alone, and the shift from arson suspect to accused quadruple murderer was, for a community following the case in real time through local news coverage, a jarring escalation. What had initially looked like a strange and tragic coincidence, one brother's house catching fire hours before another's burned with his entire family inside, had, in the span of about a week, transformed into something investigators were now confident was a single, calculated act carried out by one person against his own flesh and blood. An arrest is not the same thing as proof. In the years between Paul Caneiro's initial arraignment and the trial that would finally begin in January of 2026, investigators and prosecutors had to take a mountain of circumstantial and physical evidence and turn it into something a jury would find convincing beyond a reasonable doubt, a process that, in a case this complex, took far longer than anyone following the story from the outside expected. Detectives spent months, and eventually years, reconstructing Paul's financial life alongside Keith's. Forensic accountants combed through years of records tied to Square One Enterprises and the personal accounts both brothers had access to, building a picture of exactly how money had moved between the two men over time, and exactly how much of it had ended up somewhere Keith had never approved. That paper trail became one of the prosecution's central pillars, a financial motive that didn't rely on speculation, but on documented transfers and discrepancies stretching back well before November of 2018. At the same time, forensic scientists worked through physical evidence recovered from both properties, the mansion in Colts Neck and Paul's own home in Ocean Township. The container found in Paul's basement, holding blood-stained clothing, a latex glove, and an unspent 9mm round, became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Investigators had to establish a clear chain of custody for that evidence, verify the blood matched the victims, and connect the unspent round to the same type of ammunition used in the murders. All work that takes time, particularly when a defense team is actively contesting every step along the way. Ballistics testing tied bullets recovered at the crime scene to a gun registered to Paul. Cell phone records and financial transaction timestamps were cross-referenced against the timeline Paul had given investigators the morning of the fires, and the digital video recorder pulled from Paul's own garage, the one connected to his home security system, had to be forensically examined to determine whether footage had been deleted, tampered with, or was simply, as Paul claimed, never properly recording that night at all. Legal battles over this evidence delayed the case for years. Paul's defense team fought to have key pieces excluded, arguing they had been improperly obtained or that their evidentiary value was outweighed by their prejudicial impact on a jury. Some of those fights went all the way to the New Jersey Supreme Court before prosecutors secured rulings allowing the evidence to be presented at trial. Each appeal, each hearing, each procedural delay added months, sometimes years, to a case that had already begun with an arrest investigators believed, from very early on, they had gotten right. For the extended Caneiro family, and for a community that had followed the case since the first headlines broke in November of 2018, those years of legal maneuvering were their own kind of ordeal. A reminder, delivered again and again through court filings and continuance notices, that justice in a case this complicated rarely moves at the pace anyone outside the legal system expects it to. By the time jury selection finally began in early January of 2026, 7 years had passed since the morning firefighters found Keith Caneiro's body on his own front lawn. Paul Caneiro, who had spent the intervening years out on bail or in custody depending on the stage of proceedings, was no longer the man who had walked out of his burning house in 2018. He was 59 years old, and the case against him had grown, in that time, from a suspicious set of circumstances into what prosecutors would describe as an overwhelming body of evidence. Part of what made those 7 years so consequential was the sheer volume of material investigators had to work through. Modern homicide investigations generate enormous amounts of digital evidence, cell phone data, financial records spanning years, security footage, forensic lab results that each require independent verification and, often, independent expert testimony to explain to a jury. In a case with this much complexity, and with a defense team determined to challenge nearly every piece of it, prosecutors couldn't simply present evidence. They had to build an airtight chain of custody and expert validation for each individual component, anticipating exactly how the defense would try to undermine it at trial. The forensic accounting alone took years to complete properly. Investigators had to trace years of transactions across multiple accounts, separate legitimate business expenses from personal withdrawals, and build a timeline precise enough to show a jury not just that money had moved in Paul's direction, but that it had done so in a pattern consistent with deliberate, sustained concealment rather than any kind of legitimate business arrangement. That kind of financial reconstruction is painstaking, unglamorous work. The opposite of the dramatic breakthroughs true crime storytelling often emphasizes, but it was, by prosecutors' own account, one of the most critical pillars of the case they eventually presented. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued refining the physical evidence recovered from both properties, running additional testing as techniques improved over the years the case remained pending. DNA analysis, ballistics comparison, and fire investigation science all continued to advance during the 7 years between Paul's arrest and his trial, and prosecutors made use of updated methodology where it strengthened their case, while defense attorneys challenged the reliability of newer techniques being applied retroactively to evidence collected years earlier. Most true crime cases move, however slowly, towards some kind of resolution within a few years of an arrest. Paul Caneiro's case took 7. Between his initial arrest in late 2018 and the moment a jury was finally impaneled in January of 2026, the case moved through years of pretrial motions, evidentiary disputes, and delays, including a fight over whether key pieces of evidence would even be admissible at trial. A legal battle that went all the way to New Jersey's highest court before prosecutors secured the ruling they needed to move forward. For a case this complex, with this much physical and forensic evidence, that kind of delay wasn't unusual. But for the families of the victims, and for a community that had spent 7 years waiting for answers, it meant living with an open wound for the better part of a decade. By the time opening statements finally began on January 12, 2026, at the Monmouth County Courthouse in Freehold, Paul Caneiro was 59 years old, no longer the 51-year-old man who had been led out of his burning home 7 years earlier, but a defendant who had spent the better part of a decade maintaining, through every pretrial hearing and every headline, that he was innocent. The trial, expected to last roughly 2.5 months, unfolded in front of Superior Court Judge Mark C. Lemieux, and it was, by any measure, brutal to sit through, for the jury, for the surviving family members in the gallery, and for the reporters who covered it day after day. Jury selection alone took nearly a week, with 16 citizens ultimately impaneled, 12 jurors and 4 alternates. Once testimony began, jurors heard forensic pathologists describe, in clinical and unflinching detail, the wounds that had killed Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse. One juror later told his wife it had been a heavy day after sitting through autopsy testimony describing what had happened to Keith and Jennifer. On another day, a doctor testified that 8-year-old Sophia appeared to have died trying to dodge the knife, a detail that visibly affected even the courtroom's most experienced observers. 11-year-old Jesse, at 95 pounds, had one arm pressed against his chest when a knife went through it, one of 5 stab wounds that ultimately killed him. Testimony like that doesn't just build a legal case, it reshapes a courtroom's entire atmosphere, and by all accounts, it did exactly that throughout the 7 weeks of trial. The forensic evidence built methodically against Paul as the trial went on. Detectives who had searched his home in the days after the murders found a container in his basement holding clothing and a latex glove, with red stains later confirmed to be consistent with blood. Inside that same container, they found an unspent 9mm projectile. Ballistics experts testified that bullets recovered from the crime scene at Keith's home matched Paul's own gun, a connection prosecutors leaned on heavily to tie him directly to the shooting. Security footage became one of the trial's central battlegrounds. Police had seized the digital video recorder from Paul's home security system out of his garage during the fire, and prosecutors used the footage to try to establish a minute-by-minute account of his movements that night, a timeline that Paul's own version of events, given to the county fire marshal in the days after the murders, struggled to match cleanly. Paul told investigators he had gone to bed around 6 o'clock that evening in a spare bedroom, gotten up once around 11 to take medication before going back to bed, gotten up again briefly later to work on his computer, and was finally woken by his smoke alarms around 5 the next morning. He also told investigators he didn't believe his home security cameras had been working that day, a claim prosecutors worked hard to undercut with the footage they eventually recovered. There was one moment during the trial that briefly threatened to shift its momentum entirely. Testimony revealed that an email sent to Jennifer Caneiro had been marked red after her death, a detail that, according to the judge's later ruling, the defense team had known about and improperly withheld from prosecutors. Judge Lemieux ruled against the defense on the issue, a sharp and public rebuke in the middle of an already tense trial, and one that underscored just how contested even the smallest pieces of evidence had become by that point. That single detail, an email marked read on an account belonging to someone who was already dead, became one of the trial's more unsettling threads. Prosecutors argued it suggested someone had accessed Jennifer's device or account after the murders, potentially to cover tracks or gather information about what investigators already knew. The defense offered alternative explanations, including the possibility of automated syncing across multiple devices, technical glitches, or access by someone else entirely. Judge Lemieux's ruling on the discovery violation didn't resolve the underlying question of who had actually opened that email, but it did establish, for the jury's benefit, that the defense had not played entirely by the rules in bringing that evidence forward, a credibility blow that legal analysts following the case suggested may have quietly shaped how jurors weighed the defense's broader arguments for the remainder of the trial. Additional witnesses filled out the picture the prosecution was building. A forensic accountant walked the jury through years of financial records, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, showing the pattern of transfers prosecutors alleged constituted the theft at the heart of Paul's motive. A cell tower expert testified about the location data pulled from both brothers' phones in the days surrounding the murders, corroborating parts of the timeline prosecutors were building while raising questions about gaps in Paul's own account of his movements. A fire investigator walked jurors through burn patterns at both properties, explaining how accelerant use at Keith's mansion differed from what investigators found at Paul's own home. Differences that, the expert testified, were consistent with two intentionally set fires designed to look similar on the surface, but executed with slightly different levels of urgency and risk tolerance. Exactly what you might expect from someone setting a fire in a home he intended to survive versus one he did not. Throughout it all, Paul maintained his innocence. His defense argued that police had rushed to judgment in the earliest days of the investigation, failing to adequately consider other possibilities before zeroing in on Paul. His attorneys called their own expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's forensic timeline, including a defense expert who testified over multiple days, attempting to poke holes in the state's account of when and how the fires were set relative to the killings. Cross-examination of that witness stretched on for hours, with prosecutors pressing repeatedly on inconsistencies between the defense's theory and the physical evidence recovered from both scenes. Perhaps the most emotionally difficult testimony of the entire trial came not from a forensic expert or a detective, but from inside Paul's own family. His daughter took the stand and, according to reporters who covered the trial daily, sobbed while recalling the moment she learned that her aunt, uncle, and two young cousins had been killed. Testimony that put the human cost of the case on display in a courtroom already saturated with grim forensic detail. It was a reminder that this case had not just fractured one branch of the Caneiro family, but had left a second generation of children, Paul's own daughters, to grow up carrying the knowledge of what their father was accused of, and eventually convicted of, doing to people they had once considered family. Character witnesses for the defense tried to reinforce the version of Paul that had circulated for years before his arrest: the even-tempered brother, the reliable partner, a man devoted to his own wife and daughters. But on cross-examination, prosecutors repeatedly pointed out that none of these witnesses had any direct knowledge of the brothers' private financial dealings, and none could speak to what had actually been said on the phone call the night before the murders. It was, prosecutors argued, easy to vouch for someone's character in the abstract. It was much harder to explain away blood-stained clothing in a basement, an unspent round matching the murder weapon, and a financial motive documented in years of bank records. By the time both sides rested and closing arguments began, the trial had stretched across 7 weeks, nearly 2.5 months of testimony, evidence, objections, and the kind of grinding legal process that rarely makes it into a condensed narrative of a documentary, but that shapes every verdict eventually reached. Prosecutors' closing arguments took roughly a full day to deliver, walking the jury back through the financial motive, the physical evidence, the contradicted timeline, and the sheer improbability that two unconnected fires would strike one extended family on a single morning by pure coincidence. The defense's closing focused on reasonable doubt, arguing that despite the volume of evidence, prosecutors had never definitively placed Paul inside his brother's home at the moment of the murders, and that circumstantial evidence, however extensive, was still circumstantial. Throughout closing arguments, both sides returned repeatedly to the same central image: 2 fires, 1 family, 1 morning. For prosecutors, that image was the case in miniature: too precise, too coordinated, too convenient for the surviving brother to be coincidence. For the defense, it was exactly the kind of dramatic, emotionally loaded narrative that could lead a jury towards certainty the actual evidence didn't fully support. In the end, the jury sided decisively with the prosecution's version of events, and did so quickly enough that legal observers following the trial described the deliberation time as one of the clearest signals of how thoroughly the state's case had landed. The accumulation of evidence against him, financial motive, forensic material recovered from his own basement, ballistics tying him to the murder weapon, a shaky and contradicted timeline, and the sheer improbability of two unrelated, unconnected fires striking one extended family on the same morning had become, in the words prosecutors would later use in their own court filings, overwhelming. For 7 years, the Caneiro case never really left New Jersey headlines. It surfaced again every time there was a new pretrial hearing, a new evidentiary ruling, a new delay. Local reporters who had covered the initial fires in 2018 were often the same ones sitting in the courtroom gallery in 2026, having followed the case through nearly a decade of legal twists. Colts Neck, a town that had built its identity around privacy and understated wealth, found itself repeatedly thrust into a spotlight it never wanted. Neighbors who had lived near the Caneiro mansion for years were approached again and again by reporters, true crime podcasters, and eventually documentary crews, all asking some version of the same question: did anyone see this coming? The answer, almost universally, was no. That no is part of what makes this case so unsettling, and part of what makes it worth telling. There were no widely known warning signs, no history of documented violence between the brothers, no pattern that, in hindsight, obviously should have been caught. True crime as a genre has, in recent years, developed something like a subcategory around cases like this one. Family annihilation cases, where a person kills multiple family members at once, often followed by an attempt to disguise or misdirect from their own involvement. These cases tend to share certain features. A financial or relational motive kept hidden from extended family, a perpetrator who maintained a convincing public image right up until the crime, and an initial period of investigation where police, and often the public, assume an external threat before the truth turns out to be much closer to home. What makes the Caneiro case distinct within that pattern is the sheer audacity of the second fire, the choice to burn his own home with his own family inside as a means of deflecting suspicion. It's a detail that investigators and legal analysts alike have pointed to as almost unique in its calculation, a decision that required Paul to accept real risk to his own wife and daughters in service of protecting himself. Legal commentators who followed the trial noted that the case also raised broader questions that extend well beyond this one family. Questions about how much financial oversight siblings and business partners typically exercise over shared accounts, and how easily that kind of institutional trust can be exploited by someone determined enough to hide what they're doing. Attorneys unconnected to the case, writing after the verdict, pointed to the Caneiro trial as an illustration of how New Jersey's criminal justice system handles complex, high-profile prosecutions that intersect family law, estate and financial matters, and violent crime all at once. A reminder that cases like this rarely stay contained to a single legal category. For true crime audiences, the case became one of the more closely followed trials of 2026, competing for attention with several other high-profile cases moving through courts that same year. But for the people who actually lived near Willowbrook Road, who had sent their own kids to school with Jesse and Sophia, who had exchanged pleasantries with Keith and Jennifer at community events, the renewed media attention each time the case resurfaced wasn't entertainment. It was a wound being reopened, again and again, for 7 straight years. Court TV's gavel-to-gavel coverage of the trial gave the public an unusually direct window into proceedings that, in most homicide cases, only reporters and courtroom observers ever witnessed firsthand. Viewers could watch, in real time, the forensic pathologists describing autopsy findings, the ballistics experts walking through their analysis, and eventually, the moment the verdict was read. That level of access changed how the public engaged with the case, no longer relying solely on secondhand summaries, but able to form their own impressions of witnesses, evidence, and the defendant's demeanor throughout weeks of testimony. That kind of coverage carries its own complications. Legal analysts have long debated whether televised trials help or hurt the pursuit of justice, whether cameras in the courtroom create additional pressure on witnesses and jurors, or whether they serve an important public interest in transparency, particularly for cases involving crimes this severe. Whatever the broader merits of that debate, the Caneiro trial became, for several months in early 2026, appointment viewing for a segment of the public that had followed the case since its earliest headlines back in 2018. A rare instance of a true crime story that unfolded almost entirely in public view, from the first fire alarm to the final verdict. After 7 weeks of testimony, autopsy photographs, forensic experts, financial records stretching back years, a defense case that never fully answered the questions the evidence had raised. The case finally went to the jury in February of 2026. They deliberated for roughly 3 hours. For a trial that had taken nearly 2 months, with a day and a half of closing arguments alone, 3 hours was strikingly fast. Fast enough that prosecutors would later point to it directly in their response to Paul's appeal. The jury deliberated for, likely, around 3 hours, despite this being a 7-week trial with approximately a day and a half of summations, they wrote in their brief. Clearly, the jury was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that defendant, and no one else, committed these crimes. On February 13th, 2026, Paul Caneiro was found guilty on every count, 4 counts of first-degree murder for Keith, Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse. Aggravated arson for both fires, the one at his brother's mansion and the one at his own home. Theft charges tied to the money prosecutors alleged he had taken from his brother's accounts over the years. Inside the courtroom, there was no dramatic outburst, no visible collapse from the defendant. Just a verdict, read aloud, that had taken 7 years, 1 7-week trial, and a single afternoon of deliberation to arrive at, closing the loop on a question investigators had been quietly circling since the moment they first found Keith Caneiro's body on his own front lawn. Paul was scheduled to be sentenced on May 12th. He faced the possibility of life in prison. True to form for a man who had spent 7 years insisting on his innocence at every stage of the process, Paul didn't stop fighting once the verdict came in. Less than 2 weeks after his conviction, he filed a motion for a new trial. In public comments afterward, he suggested the guilty verdict was the product of a hostile and frustrated judge. Rather than the result of 7 weeks of evidence, a jury had just spent an afternoon carefully weighing before reaching its conclusion. Reaction to the verdict rippled well beyond the courtroom. Prosecutor Gramiccione's office, which had spent 7 years building the case from an initial arson charge into a fully proven quadruple murder conviction, issued statements emphasizing the years of investigative work that had gone into securing justice for Keith, Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse. Local officials in Colts Neck and Ocean Township, both towns forever linked by the case, offered their own statements acknowledging the toll the 7-year process had taken on the community. Legal commentators covering the case for national outlets pointed to the length of jury deliberation, just 3 hours after 7 weeks of testimony, as a striking indicator of how clearly the evidence had ultimately pointed in one direction, despite the years of legal complexity required to get it in front of a jury at all. For the surviving members of the extended Caneiro family who had waited 7 years for this moment, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Relief that the legal process had finally validated what many of them had come to believe was true, and grief reawakened by weeks of testimony that forced them to relive, in granular and clinical detail, exactly how Keith, Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse had died. Victim impact statements at sentencing, delivered by family members who had spent years waiting for this exact moment, described a hole in the family that would never fully close, regardless of what sentence Paul ultimately received. Do you think Paul Caneiro's appeal has any real chance of succeeding? Let us know why or why not. At his sentencing, Paul Caneiro received 4 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each member of his brother's family. Ocean Township and Colts Neck, 2 quiet New Jersey suburbs that had spent decades known for very little beyond their affluence, would be forever tied together by a case that shocked even prosecutors who had spent careers working violent crime. There is no version of this story with a genuinely satisfying ending, because there are no survivors on the other side of it to speak for everything that was lost. Keith Caneiro will never watch his children grow up. Jennifer never will either. Sophia and Jesse never got their next birthdays, their graduations, any of the small, ordinary milestones that were still supposed to be ahead of them on the night their mother checked on them before bed one last time. What remains, instead, is a case study in how thin the line can be between the family a person presents to the world and the version hiding underneath it, and in how far someone is willing to go to protect a secret rather than risk the people closest to him finding out the truth on their own terms. It's also, in its own way, a case study in how the legal system moves when a crime this complex, this forensically dense, and this legally contested collides with a defendant determined to fight every inch of it, from the initial arson charge through years of pretrial motions, all the way through a post-conviction appeal that, as of this recording, is still active. 7 years passed between Paul Caneiro's arrest and his conviction. 7 years in which the surviving members of the Caneiro family had to wait, watch pretrial motions come and go, and relive the worst morning of their lives over and over through headlines, hearings, and finally, a trial that forced them to sit through testimony no family should ever have to hear about people they loved. Paul Caneiro's appeal is still working its way through the New Jersey court system as of this recording. His attorneys continue to maintain that he was wrongly convicted, that the trial was unfair, that the judge who oversaw it was biased against him. Prosecutors, for their part, have already responded forcefully, standing by both the verdict and the process that produced it. But for the jury that sat through 7 weeks of graphic testimony, and for the prosecutors who spent the better part of a decade building this case from a single suspicious fire into a fully proven quadruple murder, the story reached its resolution in February of 2026 inside a courtroom in Freehold, New Jersey, with a verdict that took 3 hours to reach for a crime that had taken this family 7 long years to see justice for. Keith Caneiro trusted his brother with his money, his business, and by every account people gave of their relationship, his life. That trust is what made this case so difficult for investigators to unravel, and it's what makes it so difficult, even now, to fully sit with. The people who hurt us the most rarely arrive as strangers. More often, they're the ones already standing closest. The even-tempered brother, the business partner, the person everyone else in the family calls when they need someone level-headed. Paul Caneiro was that person, right up until the moment he wasn't. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with losing family members to violence, and a different, compounding kind of grief that comes when the person responsible is someone you also loved. For the extended Caneiro family, this case forced them to hold 2 irreconcilable truths at once: that Paul had, for years, been a genuine and valued part of their lives, and that Paul had also, on one night in November of 2018, made the decision to end 4 of those lives in the most calculated way imaginable. Family members who testified during the sentencing phase described struggling for years to understand how someone they had trusted so completely could be capable of what the evidence ultimately proved. Some spoke about no longer trusting their own judgment of people close to them. Others spoke about the specific horror of watching Paul's own daughters, who had also lost an aunt, an uncle, and 2 cousins that night, grow up under the shadow of their father's conviction, innocent of anything themselves but permanently tied to the case by their last name. Susan Caneiro, Paul's wife, has said little publicly since the verdict. She and her daughters were, by every account, victims of Paul's actions too, even if the law didn't charge her with anything. Pulled from a burning house that her own husband allegedly set, used, prosecutors argued, as unwitting cover for a murder plot they had no knowledge of. Whatever she believed about her husband's innocence for those 7 years between his arrest and his conviction, the jury's verdict left her with a version of her own family history that she will likely spend the rest of her life reckoning with. For true crime audiences encountering this case for the first time, it's worth sitting with what made it possible in the first place. Not just the financial dispute, not just the physical evidence, but the years of unquestioned trust that let it happen. Keith Caneiro didn't hand his brother access to shared accounts because he was careless. He did it because that's what brothers do, particularly brothers who have built a life and a business together since they were young men. That same trust is what makes families work, most of the time, for most people. It's also, this case demonstrates with devastating clarity exactly what someone determined to hide something can exploit, right up until a 2-hour deadline forces a reckoning that never gets the chance to happen the way anyone expected. There's also a broader lesson embedded in how long this case took to resolve, one that matters for anyone trying to understand how the justice system actually functions in cases this severe. 7 years between arrest and conviction can look, from the outside, like a system failing to move quickly enough, particularly for a case where investigators seemed confident in their theory almost from the very first week. But the reality is more complicated. Complex forensic and financial evidence takes time to properly develop and verify. Constitutional protections around evidence and pretrial procedure exist precisely to prevent wrongful convictions, even when they extend timelines that feel, to grieving families, unbearably long. The New Jersey Supreme Court's involvement in resolving key evidentiary disputes before the trial could even begin is itself a reminder that a case of this magnitude, with a defendant contesting every available legal avenue, will almost never move at the pace true crime storytelling condenses it into. As of this recording, Paul Caneiro remains in New Jersey state custody, serving 4 consecutive life sentences, while his appeal continues to work its way through the courts. Whatever the outcome of that appeal, nothing will change what a jury spent 7 weeks confirming in February of 2026, that on the night of November 19th into the morning of November 20th, 2018, Paul Caneiro shot his brother Keith, killed his sister-in-law Jennifer and his niece and nephew, Sophia and Jesse, and then set 2 homes on fire in an effort to make sure no one would ever know it was him. They knew. It just took 7 years, 1 7-week trial, and a jury that needed only 3 hours to say so. For Keith, Jennifer, Sophia, and Jesse Caneiro, no verdict changes what was taken from them. But for a community that spent 7 years waiting, and for a family that had to hold both love and betrayal in the same breath for nearly a decade, the answer finally arrived, clear, documented, and beyond reasonable doubt. What part of this case do you think deserves more attention? Let us know in the comments.